Hey, Anna from NHCSR. It is wintertime and we are planning our field season. So I'm digging into the literature and finding out what the best ways are to control pests of brassicas. So we're talking about kale, we're talking about broccoli, cabbage, Brussels sprouts. I found this paper and I thought, ooh, this could be a fun one. It's a little silly, but fun. This is Zhu et al. From 2020. This paper reports on work that was carried out in China, and the authors were evaluating just one of the key pests in the pest complex of insects attacking this family of plants. But I think the technique that they're using is really interesting, and it might be a viable approach for us to try out this summer for all of the pests that attack this family of plants here in North America. We'll get into it. So like I said, they're looking at diamondback moth specifically. They're a key pest of brassicas or cruciferous plants. Actually, it's the caterpillars that are doing the damage, but they are left there by their mothers. So they're not making the choice. Their mothers are laying eggs, and they are honing in on their hosts using smells, right? So that when they say oviposition, they're talking about egg laying behaviors. So you see, they use these smells and tastes to determine their hosts. And that's why I think there's a possibility that we could apply this technique that they're gonna try out in this paper to a wide variety of brassica pest specialists. We certainly see diamondback moth here in North America. It's a problem here too. But what you need to know is that diamondback moth is one of the most major global pest problems in vegetable systems. This paper reports that it costs farmers an estimated of 4 to 5 billion with a B dollars every year. Part of this is because of really notorious chemical resistance. They're also one of the first pests to have Bt resistance reported. So Bt is a microbial pesticide that is really important in organic systems, and there are reports of this insect being resistant to that. I don't think those were from here. I think that was from abroad. So these researchers are looking for an alternative approach that does not rely on chemical insecticides. They looked back into traditional methods of controlling this pest, and trap cropping is a very popular approach. So trap cropping is an approach that diverts pest insects from your cash crop. So in this case, we have cabbage, kale, things like that, by planting something it prefers nearby. So that is fooling those insects into going over there. You create aggregations there. So it works great until you amass a big population of pests on your trap crop. They're thriving, they're spilling over to your cash crop. So the most effective way to deploy a trap cropping approach is to use a little bit of insecticide to control that pest population on your trap crop. If you're looking for something that doesn't involve chemical pesticides, trap cropping, it can get you halfway there, but not the whole way. So this study tested a creative idea. They are using a plant that the insect pest does not eat. In this case, they're looking at faba bean. They're tricking that adult moth into laying her eggs on the non-host by making it smell like a plant that it does like. In this case, they're looking at Chinese kale, which is Brassica oleracea. It's related to all of the brassica plants that we grow here. If you fool the mother into laying her eggs on a host plant where her babies cannot survive, that is in essence a dead-end trap crop. That's where the title of the paper comes in. There's a couple different mechanisms as to why this is a dead end, which we'll get into. So here's what the researchers did. They made a water extract of Chinese kale leaves. So essentially they made like a kale slurry, a smoothie, more like kale juice. They sprayed that onto fava bean plants or leaves for different experiments. They tested whether or not adult moths would lay eggs on these treated fava beans in full plant or in discs, and then they checked whether the larvae could survive on them. So we have a couple different experiments to walk through. In this figure, you'll see larval survival rate on Chinese kale versus faba bean leaves. You see their little discs that they put caterpillars on, and after 3 days, all those caterpillars were dead, having been placed on faba bean leaves. That makes sense. They can't eat it. They're probably starving. The authors also provide a scanning electron microscope observation of Chinese kale and faba bean leaf surfaces. When I first saw this, I thought, oh yeah, beans are notoriously hairy on their undersides. That might be part of the reason the larvae are not faring very well. It's not just that they can't eat the leaves, that they're actually getting caught up in the hairs. But in this paper, they show us the adaxial surface of these leaves, which is the top of the leaf. This is not where you find insects normally. You usually find insects on the undersides of leaves. So I'm not really sure where they're going here. They made a few comments about like the waxy surface. Maybe that has something to do with it. On the top, the bean leaf surface is less waxy than the top of the kale. Okay, so we feel pretty confident that any eggs and subsequent larvae that are left on the bean leaves are certainly not going to make it longer than a couple of days. They're not going to make it to adulthood, and they're actually not probably eating very much of that leaf at all. So they do a few experiments in this paper to see what the adult moths do as far as their choice of where to lay their eggs. Here's one figure where they're looking at the number of eggs that are laid in a bunch of choice tests. So each of these pairs is an either or choice. The top experiment is Chinese kale plants that were either sprayed with water or sprayed with the kale extract. There's no difference there. You see the same experiment with just water. You're going to see more eggs laid on the Chinese kale. That's their host. That makes sense, right? And then you get to this experiment where they're looking at Chinese kale sprayed with water versus faba beans sprayed with the kale extract. Many more eggs were laid there. And what's even more interesting to me is that if you look at the host, Chinese kale sprayed with Chinese kale, you're still getting more eggs laid in the faba bean sprayed with kale water. I think that might be where they were going with the differences in the leaf surface, like having a waxier surface. Maybe that was what contributed to that difference. And then when you get down to faba bean sprayed with water versus kale extract, this is many more eggs are laid. So there's a few stories to tell there, but we feel very confident that we can fool these mothers into laying eggs if we're spraying this extract on leaves. They did another experiment where they were looking at whether or not the age of the bean plant mattered. Here in this figure, we're looking at a choice test of plants that were sprayed with water versus with the kale extract, and it looks like it doesn't matter how old the plant is. This makes me think that maybe that hairy leaf surface doesn't really matter. They also did another experiment where they're looking at how long this effect lasted, and in this paper they said that the attractive effect lasted at least 15 days. I'm a little skeptical of this. I think because it was in the inside, they did this in the laboratory, they did it in greenhouses. I think once you get this stuff outside, it probably won't last that long. But that's going to be a question down the road. Authors conclude that this could reduce damage to real crops. In a greenhouse experiment that they carried out, they estimated that about 85% of all the eggs laid in the greenhouse experiment, 85% of those eggs were laid on treated faba beans instead of kale. There's something going on here. In this figure, they're looking at the number of eggs laid by moths per day. And so you do see that effect of the eggs laid on the faba bean kind of peaking after 2 days and starting to dip down after 3 or 4 days. They did make a point about the release point, like the closer the plants are to the release point, you're going to see more eggs laid on it. This makes sense. But again, this is a greenhouse experiment. I would like to see this done outside before I get too excited. So I'm thinking about what I want to know and how this might make an interesting experiment for us here in the Northeast. Can we recreate this in the field? How long would the effect last? Would it affect other pests that attack our crops? So the other caterpillars, flea beetles, crucifer flea beetles, and there's a handful of other insects that we could encounter in the field. If it only lasts a few days, I'm guessing it might not be worth pursuing in the real world. It's a silly thing to think about making a slurry of kale juice and spraying it all over your bean plants, right? But if this is something that lasts a week, is that something you would do? Maybe you would do this once a week just for a few weeks during a really peak time where your plants were really susceptible or there was a lot of moths around. Also, Could we do this with any bean? I don't know that faba bean is a very popular bean for us to grow, but everybody loves snap beans. Everybody has a bean they love. So is it any non-host? Can we do it with anything? Can we do it with another vegetable? Can we fool these mothers into laying their eggs on anything? I would also want to test to make sure that there weren't any negative effects associated with spraying this kale juice on your plant on yield or the health of the plant. So that's something to keep in mind for the future. Let me know what you think. Is this cuckoo? Is it silly? Would you do it? What kind of beans would you grow if you wanted to grow snap beans or maybe a dry bean that you like? Let me know, and thanks for listening.